My name is Mark Tessier-Lavigne, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of Rockefeller University. I'd like to welcome you all to our fifth Insight Lecture of the academic year. As many of you know, the Insight Lecture series is designed to foster wide-ranging discussions of issues in science, health, politics, and the arts and humanities in our campus community. This evening, we're joined by three legendary speakers. First, you'll hear from entrepreneur, investor, and technology expert Vinod Khosla, founder of Khosla Ventures. Following Vinod's presentation, I'll moderate a discussion with Vinod and two of my tri-institutional colleagues, Dr. Stephen Corwin, the Chief Executive Officer of New York Presbyterian Hospital, and Dr. Craig Thompson, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. I'll say more about Steve and Craig later, but let me first introduce our speaker, Vinod Khosla. Vinod holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the IIT in New Delhi, a master's degree in biomedical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Upon graduation from Stanford, he founded Daisy Systems, which was an early computer-aided design provider. He then went on to be the founding chief executive officer of Sun Microsystems, where he led the way in developing RISC processors. In 1986, Vinod joined renowned venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers, where he continues to be a general partner today. And in 2004, he founded Khosla Ventures, a venture capital firm with a broad portfolio focusing in disruptive technologies in internet, computing, mobile, alternative energy, and medical technology investments. Through his long and distinguished career, Vinod has contributed to the growth of hundreds of companies. His pragmatism, perception, and insight, as well as his drive to make a positive impact, has led to his prominence as one of the most influential people in business today. Indeed, he's been named, quote, the #1 venture capitalist on the planet, unquote, by Forbes magazine. Now, one of Vinod's passions is being a mentor to entrepreneurs, assisting them and helping them build technology-based businesses. He's been quoted as saying how much he dislikes how venture capitalists see startups as deals rather than as people, and he calls himself a venture assistant. He's also stated that he doesn't mind a venture that has a 90% chance of failure because a 10% chance of changing the world is pretty nice. Indeed, another passion of Vinod's is pursuing innovative solutions to social problems. Through his leadership of the Indus Entrepreneurs, SKS Microfinance, CK12.org, and many other nonprofit organizations, Vinod has been tireless in his effort to combat world poverty, transform education, cultivate and nurture ecosystems for entrepreneurship and developing market economies, and finding solutions for alternative energy. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Bloom Center for Developing Economies at the University of California, Berkeley. This center is focused on finding solutions to address the crisis of extreme poverty and disease. In a 2012 New York Times article, Vinod said that Silicon Valley is not a place, but a state of mind. This evening, he will speak to us about the ways in which he's seeking to apply Silicon Valley principles and approaches to transform, even foster a revolution in healthcare. Without preempting his talk, I think we'll hear Vinod argue that much of what physicians do can be done better by well-designed sensors, passive and active data collectors, and analytics without taking away the human element of care. This is an important, even an essential perspective, and we're fortunate that Vinod has agreed to present it. So please join me in welcoming Vinod Khosla to the podium.
Thank you. I didn't recognize the person Mark was talking about, but such is introductions and resumes. Let me start by saying what I'm talking about is speculations. I know very little about healthcare, and I like to keep it that way. Because if you're going to take a fresh look at an institution like healthcare, you have to do it without biases of the system. I would suggest that most large innovations come from outside the system in every area. Whether you look at something as simple as Walmart and retailing, and Amazon had to come from the outside and change it and surprise everybody, or something as extreme as space, which SpaceX had to innovate, not NASA. And I could go on and on. General Motors did nothing with the electric car, Tesla did. NBC did nothing with media. YouTube did. In fact, I've been hard-pressed to find one major area of innovation that came from within the system. So I don't look to General Electric or IBM or any of those people to do anything innovative. The phone business was innovated by Apple, which had never done a phone before. And we know where it has gotten us. So that's my perspective. And I like the fact I know very little, and I acknowledge the fact that I know very little about healthcare. But I do look at what is possible. Let me start by talking about where we are today. And everything I say is in a paper on our website, and this deck is available, and everything has a reference, so feel free to dig deeper. Diagnostic error is so common, it would be like saying we'll allow Google to do the driverless car as long as they have no more than one accident a week. As long as the accident's hidden and people don't notice. That is the state of medicine today. More people die, or almost as many people die, with ICU misdiagnosis as do in car accidents or from breast cancer. This fact some people actually challenged me on. So I've now quoted a source for it. I've actually been challenged by physicians on this. Human doctors have cognitive limitations. It's very hard for a doctor to keep up with the last 5,000 articles on cancer research if they're an oncologist. They also have biases, all kinds of cognitive biases, and I won't go into it, but it's amazing how much fun it is to read all these articles. There's one of these lists 25 different biases and illustrates their frequency. Study of 100 cases of diagnostic error found that system-related factors contributed to fairly large percent of diagnostic errors, but cognitive factors were even larger. System-related factors would be things like lack of communication between two people with the data. Now, here's the interesting thing. Because we are human, we decide and we think we know. Premature closure is one of the largest forms of misdiagnosis. You walk into a doctor, say two things, and the doctor already knows. Fails to ask 3 other questions they should have asked to eliminate other possibilities. All the data is often there to do the right diagnosis. Here's something else that's surprising to me. This is a biased set of a second opinion line at the Cleveland Clinic. In the vast majority of cases, when somebody called this phone line for a second opinion, there was some material change in the prescription, in the therapy, in the diagnosis. That's a little sad if you think we are dealing with the science of medicine. You shouldn't have that high a percentage of changes. Now, it was a biased set in that these were people seeking a second opinion, so obviously they didn't have full confidence in the first opinion. This is a fun one. This is an assessment done by the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology. They have 7,100, 7,000 plus recommendations on practice guidelines on various topics. By their assessment, 48% of their recommendations have Class C evidence, the worst kind of evidence. They have 3 classes of recommendations, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. For each, they define the class of evidence, Class A being the best kind, Class B and Class C being the worst kind. Class C is mostly just opinion. 48% have level C evidence. 11 have level A evidence. Cardiology is about opinions. For the class 1 guidelines, the most important ones, only 19% have class A evidence. Another fun example. So whether you get surgery or not, and I believe this was cardiac surgery, only a slightly serious procedure, it depended on who you asked. But it gets worse. They took the same data and the same surgeons, gave them the same data 2 years later, 40% had flipped their opinion. Now, if this isn't for a serious procedure, dart throwing, I don't know what it is. I've been asked not to give the name of this particular procedure. This was a major public procedure, much debate about whether it should or shouldn't be done. A panel voted to ban it. They polled the panel on the probability of negative consequences. That was the distribution. It is meaningless. An expert opinion in this topic is meaningless. I'll come back to that later. This is the more defined procedure. 17 experts estimated the effect of screening on colon cancer death rates. Flat distribution. Dart throwing again. Not even a normal distribution. It's just a flat distribution. We don't have a clue. Something many of us have probably dealt with. Your child gets high fever, what do? You give them an antibiotic, you want to reduce fever. That is medical practice. It's really never been fully tested. University of Miami Hospital did a study in the pediatric care ICU. There were 7 times more deaths among children whose fever was reduced. Then, when the fever wasn't reduced, they discontinued the study on ethical grounds. Yes, yet most of the world still continues to follow the practice of reducing fever. There were a few more details that they're in the references. So when my son calls me and says, "Dad, I have high fever, what should I do?" My answer is very simple. If you want to get better, don't do anything. If you want to feel better, go take aspirin. Yet that's not medical practice. I'll have a number of quotes from the Institute of Medicine, which systematically studies these issues. But the idea that your doctor is right is not really true. It will get worse. Many of these guidelines are wrong. Every hospital system has a set of protocols. But when I ask people who develop those protocols, why is yours different from the other guys? The usual answer is, ours is better. Now, we can't have 200 best protocols for the same thing. There is only one best answer. But everybody has an opinion. And that's the state of medicine today. Another great example. Anybody who's in cardiac medicine knows beta blockers before serious surgery is pretty effective, but it's at increasing the risk of mortality. This study is stunning, came out, yet this change in practice has not propagated at all. It's actually a pretty serious thing, yet for some reason, because no single institution benefits from propagating this wisdom, it hasn't propagated. Nobody gets to make money at it. Even the idea of LDL levels, we'd never examined if lowering LDL levels actually helps. It was two young doctors who asked for evidence for efficacy in a panel, and again, that guideline has now been changed. This is my favorite. Dr. Ioannidis is probably one of the best known experts in medical studies. He's now at Stanford Medical School, but used to be in Greece when I started following him because I was examining about 5-6 years ago on the question of how good is expert opinion as we use it today in society. He says that for most study designs and settings, it is more likely for a research claim to be false than right. In fact, if you read the SPLOS paper, it sort of says the majority, possibly the vast majority, is the language he uses. So even when you have a study, it's most likely wrong. That's pretty stunning. And then there's single point studies and recommendations based on individual diseases in pristine patients that only have one disease. This is a classic example from this particular study. Your guidelines for osteoporosis would be directly contradictory to your guidelines for diabetics. If you have both, you're out of luck. And by the way, the average patient in Medicare today is treated by 7 physicians, each giving recommendations. I sort of find it a little sad that this is the state of medicine. So that leads me to how do you change the system? There are too many misaligned incentives for us to change the system as we know it, especially in the United States, but probably in most parts of the world. I'll give you one stunning example that the CEO of Kaiser Permanente gave me. He said, hospitals measure revenue on bed nights. If a patient gets an ulcer, you get an extra $40,000 of revenue. What is the incentive to reduce that bed sore? So I turn to people who will ask naive questions, and I'm going to now move more into speculation than science, and I'll admit it's speculation. And I asked the question, most systems have gotten better when you took humans out of biased loops, judgmental loops. And what is that role for humans, if any? The thesis I'm working on, and that I fundamentally believe we are enabling because, and by the way, I don't believe doctors are bad or dumb or too selfish. None of that. I just believe so far we haven't had access to a better system. Doctors do the best they can with the constraints they have. My view is, in the future, the patient will be the CEO of his own health, informed by systems based on real data. Let me talk a little more about where this might lead. I almost always get asked, what about the human element of care? In fact, I can prove to you human beings aren't rational. Human disease isn't rational. The placebo effect proves that it's not rational. We know that people with support systems survive cancer better. So the human element of care is important. But then I asked the questions. Maybe we should use the most humane humans for the human element of care. And of course, I always make fun of English majors and film school graduates, but maybe this will be a good use for UCLA film school graduates. They are more empathetic. They have more mirror neurons. The flip side of it is machines are better at integrative medicine. across all symptoms. That means not just the doctor asking you how you're feeling, but actually knowing from your jawbone how your number of steps has changed. Knowing from the right application the 1,000 activities per day it's tracked for the last 5 years. And I'll come back to this issue. How do you actually do that? Computers can now read facial expressions better than most doctors can. The technology was developed to see how you respond to advertising, but it can read your demeanor pretty well. Of course, lots of other stuff. One little system that was developed for acute care with medical assistance was 91% accurate without access to labs imaging, just based on symptom description. And Oregon Acute Care Clinic was able to triage 75% of the people coming in to see a doctor safely. And they set the guidelines very, very safely. LifeCom 2 was essentially developed to match expert diagnosis with very high accuracy. By the way, this system was developed by a physician whose wife was not diagnosed with lymphoma in time. If you had collected her symptoms, as he would say, over the course of 2 years, every time she went to see a doctor, longitudinally across her half a dozen visits and complaints, you would have known she had lymphoma, but in any one visit, you couldn't tell, and the doctors looked at her diagnosis, her condition then, didn't connect it to the last 6 visits. He then developed this system. These are pretty naive systems. I sort of call them version 0 systems, sort of like your floor-mounted cell phone in cars that existed in 1986. Here's another example that I love. This was a study done at Stanford. They looked at pathology of cancers. They were much better than pathologists. And the reason the system was much better than pathologists was it figured out that beyond the tumor, if you looked at how the tissue around the tumor was responding, you were much better at predicting the outcome for that patient. This was also not a question that was ever asked of the system. It decided in an evolutionary fashion that that was an important question to look at, transcending the questions the human pathologists knew to ask. New questions, I'll come back to that. So what we are dealing with today with IBM Watson and others is really version 0 systems. We're dealing with Watson and LifeCom and other attempts, and there's a couple, are really what I call toddler MDs. And they will make lots of mistakes. I almost prefer to call them digital first aid kits than real medicine. And they, to understand what they feel like to me, or what your cell phone felt like when they first came out. And every 2 to 3 years, the cell phone improved. There are lots and lots of point innovations happening. I'm trying to keep track of time here, falling a little behind, so I'll move along quickly. And I won't go through all of them, but I will give you a few examples. This company is developing an EKG machine, fits into your iPhone case. By the way, it just got approved last week for over-the-counter without a prescription sale for an EKG machine by the FDA. And it's just a cell phone case. That's all it is. And costs $10 or $15 to make. They sell it for a little more. But if I essentially open up the app and hold my phone, my EKG shows up here. and I'm excited, so my heart's pumping a little faster. But my point is, these kinds of machines that cost almost nothing, you couldn't do patient intake for the $10 that machine cost, could replace your EKG that you take if you're a cardiac patient. If you're a cardiac patient and go schedule an EKG, you may or may not be having symptoms for the 30 seconds those electrodes are connected when the doctor is going to read them. I take my EKG every time I feel like it. If I'm climbing a hill and I'm panting, I take my EKG. If I'm not feeling well, I take an EKG. I'm not even a heart patient, but I want to have a baseline. And if I send all 500 EKGs I took the last 3 months to my physician, guess what he's going to say? So that's where machines have to detect what are the shifts in my baseline. What's the pattern change? Those are the kinds of technologies that I call version 1 point innovations. Here's another example. That's a watch I wore for about 2 days last month. This is my heart rate variability, and activity level over the course of 48 hours. This is my RR versus RR1 interval. Says I don't have AFib. This is my blood pressure every second for those 2 hours. And you know what happens to my blood pressure when I fall asleep. I don't want to spend too much time on it. This is my metabolic activity level, and my caloric consumption is in green every 15 minutes for those 48 hours. I collected 20 million data points in the 2 days I wore this watch. Not something I could give to a physician. This is my skin temperature, by the way, during those 2 days, and varies a lot. My point is, all this data feeds into discovering new patterns, just like that pathology system discovered the important thing wasn't the tumor, but the tissue around the tumor. I won't go through all of this. Ginger.io is a mental health monitor. While your psychiatrist can see you for an hour a week or hour a month, this system tracks about 1,000 activities. It knows if you didn't get out of bed. It knows if you didn't walk from your bedroom to your kitchen. It knows if you didn't text your friends when you normally do. It knows if you didn't email or if you didn't call your mom on Saturday morning like you normally do. It figures out what's normal for you, who you call, and tracks about 1,000 activities. Today, all it does is gives your psychiatrist a dashboard to know which patients are red, which are orange, and which are green. But in fact, the system knows more than your psychiatrist could possibly ever know. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides in the interest of time. But this particular company is already finding every misdiagnosis based on current patient data. Plug it into your system, and probably find misdiagnosis in any hospital system. They're running a trial right now. Now, that's a misdiagnosis. Failure to ask those extra 2 or 3 questions that might indicate something else was wrong. It's discovering the medical graph, and it's finding that with a few extra questions, you can probably find new diagnoses that would be otherwise have been a source of error. I talked about clinical guidelines or protocol charts. If most medical studies are wrong, what do? If you have all your historical data, you can run any study over again with a real population in seconds. This particular company can actually run any medical study on your patient population based on real medical records and know whether that's pre-selected thing based on which a drug or procedure was approved is actually valid. to avoid drug interactions, to do any study, anytime in seconds. I won't go through all of it. Of course, all this kind of data is also extremely valuable to your diagnosis, and physicians can only guess at it, or these are all point innovations, but what we are finding is these point innovations. I mentioned cardiology, I mentioned psychiatry. We are actually building a little device that attaches to your cell phone, another cell phone case. I slap in this thing, and it becomes an otoscope, and I can take a video of your child's ear, or your mother can. This is, again, just a piece of plastic, costs $5 or $10. It not only tells you what's wrong almost instantaneously. You don't have to wait for an appointment the next day, pull your kids out of school, go see the pediatrician, and then go see the ENT specialist. I see a few heads nodding. With 4 children, I've done this enough times. My point is, each of these specialties will start to get first assisted and amplified. So you can do a lot more without needing that level of care. They will then combine into an explosion. In 2004, I gave a talk, and that was when the cell phone still was very traditional, had a keyboard, and you mostly used it for speaking, and I called it the device that used to be a phone. The iPhone wasn't introduced till 2007, and everything I speculated about what the device would do was wrong, but I was directionally right in a cell phone would mostly be used for things other than talking. I see that kind of transition again, and I see all these point innovations that are going to combine in unusual ways into a new practice of medicine. So if you look at this as version 1, version 7 will be like your iPhone. And of course, there's version 15 to come later. And every 2 to 3 years, you'll see a new significant revision. That phone looks nothing like that. Today's medical systems look like that. And so to really imagine in 15 years or 7 generations, whether it's 15 or 20 is largely irrelevant. This is where we are heading, to the point where when I gave a talk at Stanford Medical School about 2 months ago, I said, if I were trying to be a great doctor, I might go to math school instead of med school. Machine learning has all kinds of interesting implications. And the most important thing is it leads to discoveries we didn't know were questions we needed to ask. The pathology example is just one little example. And I'll come back to this because it's very interesting what it leads to. The best MDs will train these systems. They will initially just be assistants and amplify doctors or offload them or allow their nurse practitioners to do more. I call it bionic assist and amplification. We'll have the very best doctors train these algorithms, not your average doctor, not your median doctor, for those of you who are statistically inclined. In fact, what was funny was there's a system now being used to teach doctors how to, it's training in empathy. I found it sort of ironic that a computer system was being used to teach empathy. Here's another thing. This was another study that said human beings actually didn't like receiving instruction from authority. They didn't feel empowered to ask stupid questions. They felt doctors were in a rush. They preferred computers to provide them information, at least in this one study. Now, these kinds of studies are often wrong, so that's why I call them directional. Let me give you one stunning example of what data science discovered at Kaiser Permanente. By changing the protocol around statin administration, they reduced stroke deaths by 40%. Now, no drug for stroke has ever reduced stroke deaths by 40%. And oh, by the way, the FDA just approved the first mobile phone app as a drug. Because it's a drug, you pay, the formulary price is $180 a month. And every 3 months, you have to get a refill for your mobile app. But it is an app to reduce blood sugar. It competes directly with metformin. And approved by the FDA. First time software has been approved. These are data findings from data. Now, I've been pre-diabetic for 20 years, but I keep getting statins. My doctor never told me it's a risk factor for me going to diabetes or staying up late at night, something I should have learned. But here's the other thing. One of the researchers I'm working with discovered that because I'm Indian, statin prescriptions are exactly the wrong dosage. I need about 3 times the typical dosage of statins, a range in which statins have never been safety tested. And that's true of all Indians. Oh, and by the way, Japanese need half the dosage that's been approved because they metabolize that drug differently. This particular system took the National Breast Cancer Database, the Cancer Genome Atlas, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Well mined for a dozen years by every drug company and researchers. Within the first few hours, they discovered what were potentially new subpopulations, new clusterings, that became targets for new cancer drugs by somebody who knew nothing about cancer or especially breast cancer. These were breast cancer patients. These are surprising discoveries. Systems will surprise us. There was an article on a Google program and said the designers of the program have no clue how the system is making decisions. And I tweeted that. And this friend of mine who works on this at Google called me and said, why is that surprising? You're building intelligent systems to learn for themselves and discover new things. Why are we surprised? And so linear extrapolations and examples of why things didn't work will happen. Oh, this is another one of my favorite examples. The Kaggle is a little company that just runs data science competitions. They outperformed 3 years of HIV research in 1.5 weeks. The point I'm making, and this is probably the most important slide, we've had a practice of medicine. It's the best we can do. But we are at the cusp over the next 15 or 20 years to turn that truly into the science of medicine. I think data science will do more, and I know not many data scientists and a lot of biological scientists here. That's not to say fundamental biological research isn't important. We still need to do that. I'll be wrong in the specifics, but directionally right. I'm convinced we will reinvent medicine and make it much more accessible to everybody. I was starting to say earlier, I started on this quest to say there's a 10x worse doctor-to-patient ratio in a place like India. How do you solve that problem? I actually looked at how do you start in our medical schools, how do you train enough teachers to teach the students, and the problem is not solvable any other way except through innovations like this. Nobody lets a human being fly a complex airplane anymore. 15 years ago, on Wall Street, it was thought ridiculous that you could let a computer make investment judgments. Today, it's considered ridiculous that you don't, that human beings can compete with computers. And people laughed at you 15 years ago if you said computers could actively trade too complex a set of judgments involved. Of course, Google's self-driving car. I'll skip past that. We don't have sensors. We will. I'll give you, since I often, every time I give a talk, some press person asks some expert. Let me answer the expert question because they will have opinions. Professor Tetlock at UC Berkeley followed 250 experts across all their forecasts for 20 years. The average accuracy of expert forecasters was about the same as dart-throwing monkeys. If you want a rigorously statistical treatment, because this was statistically valid data, read a book called Expert Political Judgment. Covered everything from brain surgeons, brain scans to international politics and economics. Here's another thing. In today's medicine, this is sort of near the end. Patient preference does not count. Doctors, you know doctors are more aggressive and doctors are less aggressive. That's their bias. It's not what the patient wants. There was a study done. Almost every time a patient was well informed, they tended to prefer less aggressive and costly therapies. So this is about empowering the patient to do the things the patient wants and letting him control his health the way he'd like to see it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very provocative talk, which I know will give rise to a lot of conversation now. And I'd like now to introduce the other two participants in the conversation. Although Steve Corwin and Craig Thompson are well known in the tri-institutional community here, I do think I should introduce them nonetheless. Steve has been affiliated with the New York Presbyterian Hospital for over 2 decades. He joined the management team of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in 1991 and went on to serve in various capacities, most notably as Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer, and for several years as Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. Then in 2011, he was named Chief Executive Officer of New York Presbyterian Hospital. In addition to overseeing the operations of all 5 hospital campuses, he's been a true leader in advancing the institution's strategic initiatives. Before Craig Thompson took the helm of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in 2010, he was affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania for 11 years as a professor of medicine and the first chairman of the Department of Cancer Biology. In 2006, he was named director of the Abramson Cancer Center and associate vice president for cancer services of the University of Pennsylvania Health System. Craig is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and currently serves as a member of the Medical Advisory Board of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and a member of the Lasker Prize jury, among many other distinguished affiliations. Both Steve and Craig lead huge, complex medical enterprises, and we're thrilled they're able to join us this evening to build on the conversation that Vinod has started. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Maybe before I turn to Steve and Craig for their thoughts and reactions to Vinod's comments, I'd just like to ask Vinod a question, which is, you told us you're not an expert, and in many ways that was important to be an outsider in this situation. Were you surprised by the initial responses to your opinions and predictions about healthcare from physicians and from others?
You know, it's interesting. In the popular press and the flyby questions, you got the expected reaction. He doesn't know what he's talking about. When I talk to people who are deeply engaged in medicine, much more knowledgeable and have lived their lives in medicine, they weren't surprised, and I'd say they didn't quite know what the solution was or how it might evolve, but I would say the general answer I got was plausible. Probably not probable, but plausible was the general answer I got. And I did test this with the CEOs of probably 4 or 5 major health systems and say, am I completely out to lunch? Because I wasn't sure. And still am not.
Well, we're fortunate we have the CEOs of 2 health systems sitting here, so we can ask them whether you're out to lunch. But more specifically, Craig, Steve, Vinod has laid out what he sees as a number of problems in the system and called attention to what he sees as the potential revolutionary impact of applying technology to medicine. What are your reactions to what he said? Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? Please share your thoughts.
I think, Vinod, your first part of your talk, I think there's uniform agreement in this room about. I would rephrase it for many of the audience to say that we are just at the threshold of turning the delivery of medical care into a true science. And we need a lot of help in doing that. We unfortunately have a public that thinks we've solved every biological problem and therefore we can just apply them and we'll get a healthy human being. And that isn't true. And so America has led biomedical innovation by doing basic research to understand basic biological principles. They're slightly different than the simple way in which one builds an engineering device, and therefore we need to understand the full breadth of what basic science is being undertaken by biological organisms to self-organize and maintain themselves, and then how we could assist with the things that go wrong. And so I think there's uniform agreement that you're right. It's only 10% of the knowledge that we have to actually optimize medical care. And 10% may be overestimated. Many people have heard me give versions where I've said we maybe know 50% of what we need to know for cancer. I really think it's probably closer to 10%, but we try and be optimistic. On the other hand, I think the second point that you made is an extremely important one, which is that nothing beats having the ability to have a greater set of data brought to the bear. The physician that makes the judgment too quickly. And we're in a public national debate right now about how long or how much time a physician, whoever the caregiver, whether it's a computer or somebody else, can devote to an individual patient going forward. So the physician, the caregiver, that's a nurse practitioner, or a computer that a patient analyzes, how long are they, even if you say a computer is going to do that, how long is the patient going to sit there and let the computer collect that data? Whether it's by answering a pull-down menu, whether it's by actually putting a sensor and watching for 24 hours on them, what you can do, how much invasion an individual is going to take. Because you'll always ask one more question, and we're going to learn that. And then you struggle against the difference between the wonderful things that you've given us, which are engineering solutions, and the answer to the problem of human beings, which is biology, which is we're an obsolescent machine, and we don't know how to fix that completely. And we have human behavior that intersects with how we are actually delivering that care. And so the best example of this is we have, in the average BMW, 528 computer sensors. It can tell you and adjust your car. So that's a pretty well-engineered device right now. It's a beautiful car. But you go around and ask how many people in this room use that to make the decisions about how they're going to repair their car. They don't. They take it to a human being who actually fixes that car, who has specialized expertise. There's not one person here, and that would not have been true 20 years ago, who fixes their own car, who takes responsibility for that. But more important, this is New York, so half of us don't have a car. Okay, so I have a graduate student as a son who's a graduate student, PhD at Caltech. So in California, they all have cars. And the issue is he owns a car. He actually inherited it from us, and he's been driving around right now for about a year with what every cab driver, every third cab driver in New York does, which if you look up at his dashboard, the little engine is lit bright yellow. And he's still driving around, and he isn't taking it to a repair shop. He's not trying to optimize it. So those computers are completely defeated by the failure of the human being to deal with what's being detected. And that's simple, because you can buy every part you need to fix a car. You can build every car in America over again with parts you can buy for a process. You can't fix a human being that way. We can't do that. So I think it's an incredibly fascinating challenge you've given us. I actually accept pretty much all your premises, but I'm not sure how this partnership between the massive ability to collect and sift through data and the expertise needed to deal with an obsolete machine and interpret that for patients is actually going to play out.
Steve?
Well, I thought it was a very interesting and provocative and directionally correct talk, if I want to use your terms. There's no question that we have an economically unsustainable model of care in this country, number one. Number two, we make too many misdiagnoses. We have too many errors. We do a lot of things wrong. And also that most of the practice of medicine is not evidence-based, and there's not the evidence base for a lot of the practice of medicine. And so you're based on expert opinions, an apprenticeship model, the ability to understand pattern recognition and to make a diagnosis. And I don't think there's any question that we've seen in many areas of medicine that the use of data, the use of computers, the use of data analytics helps. And we see that in hospital systems, and we see that in cardiology. So I think directionally you're absolutely correct. I think the integrative function is an interesting one as to how that will happen. And obviously you're using a human being's brain to do the integration. And some people are good at it and other people are not. So I don't think there's any question that that will happen. I think that the state of it, as you said, is we have a lot of data points. We have a lot of sensors. We don't have a lot of integrating capability from those sensors. So it's nice that you can show us all the things that you do on your Fitbit, but whether that has any relevance or not is highly debatable in my mind. And if you brought that into somebody to integrate that data, whether it has any relevance to whether you'll develop a particular disease or not, I don't know. But I think it was an interesting talk, and I agree with the directionality of it.
So I just want to give one clarification. I don't think a human being will be interpreting that data. I don't believe they'll be integrating. And whether you're talking about healthcare or sick care, which is what we call healthcare today, you're talking about a level of data that human beings cannot possibly integrate. Right?
I agree with you, but if I may interrupt for a second, at some point, there's judgment in the process. You raise the issue of second opinions, and you raise the issue of somebody coming for an opinion and some people saying yes and some people no. Because the evidence is never going to be complete. The body of data is never going to be complete, and at some point you have to rely on somebody's judgment. You're saying that judgment is going to come from an algorithm, and I'm not sure that that's going to happen. Not in the near term, for sure.
And that's something we can disagree on, because I actually believe these systems will be much less biased. They won't have all the cognitive biases. The fact is, if a physician had, there's 15,000 diseases, 50,000 procedures, devices, drugs you can do. That's roughly the level of complexity of medicine. A human being can't keep that and the last 5,000 studies on that particular disease in their head. When I look at a disease in the way I imagine 15 years from now, a blood sample will be not 13 data points or 22, not your CMP panel, but today we have a company that's routinely doing 300,000 biomarkers out of every blood sample, and they've essentially proven they can replace a physical colonoscopy with a blood test, because the system can determine, based on the patterns of biomarkers, complex patterns of biomarkers, whether you actually are getting polyps or not. That kind of thing won't rely on somebody judging what the video looks like. So all I'm saying is that integration, that judgment in most complex systems, whether it's really expensive airplanes or hedge fund trading or driverless cars, is going to computers, and judgment will be the next big thing computers will replace in all of human endeavor, which is sort of scary and not necessarily all good, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, I heard you.
Maybe I can ask, Vinod's proximate prediction, so for the near term, is devices like the ones that he showed us, that he's carrying around in his pocket, that he showed us examples of, are going to be generating data. A lot of individuals will start buying these, generating that data. Presumably software will come along to enable you to package it so that you don't have to bring reams of printouts and things like that, but you can have a little chip that will, or a memory stick that organizes everything. Do you have any plans in the near term to set things up so that Sloan Kettering or New York Hospital, you could take data that the patient brings from their Fitbit or other things so that they could augment the diagnosis by the physician?
Yeah. So, yes.
So I'll answer for the Memorial, and Steve can answer for New York Presbyterian. Obviously, we just take care of cancer patients. We are a second site referral for most patients coming having been told they have cancer. Our issues are on the delivery of care, and the delivery of care in Upper East Side of Manhattan is extraordinarily expensive, as Steve just pointed out. And so we also see that hospitals are not the best place to get most of care. The faster you can get somebody out of a hospital recovering at home, they are going to do better. They're going to get more integrated in life. They're less likely to have an accident writ large in their care by being in their own home environment and getting care within their standard routine. But the devices that Vinod told us about are absolutely influential because they can be compared to a baseline set of information you can acquire on that patient. And that it's very good to send patients home, even when having the risks of complicated aftermaths of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy, if we can monitor a set of standardized vital signs, of which he demonstrated a number of very valuable ones. And so we are partnered with several venture firms that are building exactly those kind of long-term telemetry devices that can be using the standard information network and the beautiful ability he showed of a cell phone or whatever remote Bluetooth-assisted device can actually be used for this. And it will absolutely revolutionize our ability to lower the cost point and allow patients to recover in a more appropriate setting, which is closer to their home, their family, their environment, and their support care network, which is always going to be greater than what you can provide in any hospital situation. So I think in incremental bets, we're going to do lots of the things that you're saying. I'm not as convinced. I'm more on Steve's side about where the analytics will get to us in terms of making primary diagnoses or shortcutting, having the expertise to sort of, I think that a computer can set that problem up, but there's someone else that's going to actually have to take ownership of that knowledge, because the problem is, how do you deal with arbitrary guidelines? And so, for an example, right now we set in laboratory tests a 95% confidence level. We say somebody else has to deal with a problem when it's a 5% outside of 95%. That, if you leave that to the public and getting information from any kind of automated system, 5% in this country is 15 million people. And so you can't deal with the problem of 15 million people who are normal, who by any arbitrary setting of a collection of data are going to be abnormal. If you take the EKG machine you showed and you stick it up to me, my EKG is always normal when I go to Steve's hospital. And now I'm unfortunately at an age where they make me have an EKG anytime Steve's faculty want me to do anything. It's always normal because, just like you said, I get nervous. My heart rate goes up. But you do it to me sitting at home at night, I'm in stable bigeminy. And my family's been in stable bigeminy with rest for 3 generations. And you won't get anybody to take me in to do anything standard. So I know I have to be excited when I get an EKG, or his physicians will be nervous about doing anything with it. So that's just a variant of normal.
But Craig, if granted 5% might be 15 million people, but wouldn't it be great to have 95% of people taken care of by algorithms and systems?
Because the problem is that's for one test. What if you do 6 tests? So some of them will correlate, and the machine will tell us that, and so they're a battery that tells us something. And that will be why the algorithms are going to be important. I agree with you. If I could start over again, I'd start with a math degree and then go on. But I don't think you can deal with the complexity. Humans are a widely outbred population. It's not like the production line of an iPhone where everyone is pretty close to identical. We are as diverse as anything that's ever been created.
So again, I want to issue this clarification. There's first-generation systems, so we know from a medical perspective what blood pressure is, what's high, what's low, and sensors that we get focused on, or the EKG I just talked about, are, to me, fairly linear extensions of home care and others. Right. And frankly, those are less interesting to me. I think if we start collecting enough data, we'll discover a whole new medicine, a set of rules and regulations that will be tested. They haven't been. Today, they're just speculations, that we will discover are much better ways. For example, everybody takes your heart rate, but every research paper will tell you there's more data in heart rate variability than in heart rate, and how quickly your body responds when you need to change your heart rate. But because it's not been feasible to measure your heart rate variability, especially on an ongoing basis, it's not used in medical practice. Maybe some rare research studies, but it's not used in medical practice. I find it silly that in this day and age, most people discover they have heart disease by having a heart attack. Right? That's how most people all over the world discover they have heart disease, which is a little backwards to me. If I have my sleeping heart rate every night because my bed sensor tracks my heart rate, and that rate possibly is going up over 2 or 3 years, 5 years, then I know it's time for a checkup. So that's just news. I'm just speculating, but there's probably thousands of new facts like that we will discover. I can tell you in mental health, where we are actually collecting the data only in thousands and tens of thousands of patients, we are discovering new behavior insights.
Vinod, just to push back, why won't my son get his car fixed? He goes the yellow light. He knows it'll be optimized. That system was actually engineered to tell him there's something inoperative about his system. But because his car still drives, he doesn't care. He's got something more important. And you've got to fix that problem for human beings if you give them the health problem.
So I want to open up for some questions from the audience, but maybe I'll ask Steve. Vinod has a prediction, X number of years from now, 20, 30, 80% of what physicians are doing today will be done by machines, and maybe they'll be spending more of their time with the patient, focusing on the humane side of the interaction. Correct prediction?
I think it's directionally correct. I don't know if it's 80%, but you can see it happening. Absolutely.
I don't want to argue. I know precisely what the number is either. I agree with you.
I don't dispute that. I think that's you can see it already.
Great. Well, let's open up to questions.
I wish you would comment a little bit on some of the earlier material you presented, that physicians and experts generally make the wrong decision. So imagine the scenario that you've described where we have better evidence, better data, better information, but we still have fundamentally flawed abilities to make the right decision, whether we're an expert, a clinician, or a patient. So in the brave new world you're describing, could you comment on what systems and what human subject factors can be changed that can use better data, better synthesis, better algorithms, but make better decisions?
The best way to do that is eliminate the human in the loop. That is sort of fundamentally what Craig and I disagreed on, maybe the only thing we've disagreed on, at least directionally. Because here's a common fact. There was a study done on the number of press mentions in autism and the number of autism diagnoses. The fact is, because of a psychological bias called recency bias, if somebody has read about autism recently, they're much more likely to diagnose it the next time they see a child. So if there's a press mention, if the New York Times writes about autism, the number of diagnoses actually goes up. It's pathetic, but it is us human beings, all of us, me included, have this bias. And by the way, the expert opinion thing I gave you applies to me too. I don't trust my own opinions very much. One thing I know is I'm often wrong. But humans are not good at certain things, and we shouldn't use them for that. We don't use them to fly in complex solutions or now in hedge fund trading, or I could give you lots and lots of examples. They shouldn't be driving cars. You know, you're not going to prevent a human being from putting on lipstick while driving or drinking a cup of coffee. So let's solve the problem by eliminating their driving, and Google's doing. The early data from Google's driverless car, and it's not even version 1, says it's already safer than human beings. 500,000 miles driven without an accident. It had one accident when it was in manual human drive mode, parking, and they ran into the car they were parking next to.
I'm curious if you would give us your prediction as to the direction in which the health payments will evolve. This touches on some current topics in terms of, let's say, health insurance. Drug development, you mentioned, for example, software being considered a drug, and also with perhaps internet as or utilities as a point of reference. There's an ongoing debate as to the extent to which one should pay for access or have it regulated at a national level.
Want me to take that?
Yep. Steve?
Well, we spend $2.7 trillion in this country on healthcare. That's the 5th largest GDP in the world. And it is, as I said before, an unsustainable trend. So I think that the payment system has to change from more of a volume-based to a value-based purchasing model. And what I mean by that is you have to be paid for quality, you have to be paid for outcomes, you should be penalized if you don't deliver those. And I think that it's evolving in that direction. So some people move towards a capitated system where you would get a payment, a per member per month payment, as opposed to a more traditional fee-for-service environment. It'll be a mix of those types of things, but I think that you'll see payment for value as opposed to payment for volume. In addition, I think that there will be more risk put on the patient, the consumer, because the consumer now is completely, or many consumers are completely divorced from what the cost of care is. And so you're seeing more in the way of high deductible plans and more in the way of co-payments, and that system is going to evolve over the next 10 to 15 years. So I think that more people will get insured. The Affordable Care Act is, despite all its problems, will continue to march forward. We have to insure more people to ensure the health of the country, and the payment system is going to evolve to the necessary economics, and that's going to mean that value is going to be rewarded as opposed to volume.
Vinod, a lot of your discussion addressed the diagnostic piece of a doctor's role, but it didn't really address the other half, which is the treatment of whatever the diagnosis is. And of course, that is something that often is the answer is not known, and inherent in a lot of your comments is this presupposition that if you could know what the diagnosis is, then you could know what the treatment is. So I'm curious what you see as the role of technology in the development of novel therapeutics and treatments.
I'm glad you asked that question. I didn't mean just diagnosis. I also mean prescription. I also mean adding qualitative factors in terms of patient preference into the prescription. Do I want a more aggressive therapy? Do I really want to increase my chances of living longer and deal with whatever I have to, the most aggressive kind of therapy now, or do I want to just live out the rest of my life in a better quality of life, even if it's shorter? Those are patient preferences. Those will be part of the complex judgments a system can make that's very hard for a doctor to make on a personalized basis. But I'll go further and say where the largest improvement may come is in monitoring how a prescription, whether it's a procedure or a drug, is working. If my heart rate's responding differently, I showed you my blood pressure minute by minute, my heart rate. Turns out if I took a Sudafed, you could immediately tell. So medication compliance may actually be done through a device where you're wearing, which says, if your heart rate didn't change or your heart rate and blood pressure didn't change in a particular way, you didn't take your medication, you get a text message from the system that says, please take your medication. But monitoring and how well a drug is working this may be the only way to do that. And if you want to change drugs, you don't try them serially. You may be able to tell immediately if it's effective or not, if it works for your physiology.
Craig, you wanted to add something?
So this is, Vinod and I are agreeing that there's one point we disagree on, and where the human element factors into that. I agree with everything he just said about how this would facilitate better health care in terms of the monitoring he's talked about in the place of drug recovery. But the actual data is that the average person, only 1 in 10 patient takes their prescription the way they're supposed to until they complete taking the medications. And yes, we would do better with that, but it won't fix that problem. Every intervention has failed to fix that problem because people are people. And every single one of you has a prescription at home where you were supposed to have taken them all and you still have 10% of those pills.
Steve?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Vinod said, and the reason that I agreed with him in terms of where this is going is very simple. If you look at an individual doctor, and then the development of specialization, and then the development of academic medical centers, you're looking at system development along those human lines. And the reason we think that large academic centers are better than, let's say, community hospitals or individual solo practitioners is you have a combination of resources and a combination of intellect where ostensibly that system can provide a higher degree of certainty than a standalone system. So it seems logical to me, and we're already seeing it, that as we go from an academic medical center system of humans to humans enabled by technology, that we're going to move more towards technology. And I think that goes on the diagnostic and the therapeutic side.
Mark, I just want to add one more comment I'm actually pretty excited about. Usually since disease happens, there's plenty of comorbidities. You end up being treated by 6 people, and I actually think the first generation or the third or fourth generation systems will enable your primary care physician to do much of the integration of what 6 specialists are trying to do to you. Right? And that gets pretty exciting in terms of the improvement in care, because the primary care physician can actually have the knowledge of each of the specialists in the context of him knowing the patient over the last 10 or 20 years.
You showed us the problem of people with multiple diagnoses and conflicting clinical guidelines, which I think is very common in medical practice, at least a small part of it I've seen so far. I was wondering how you think your algorithms can solve these problems, because I think they will run into the same conundrum, I guess.
Look, there's never a perfect solution, but there's a much better solution than is done today. If you're a drug company and doing a drug for diabetes, you actually don't deselect for anybody who might have hypertension at the same time. Right? And so you're developing, whether it's a drug or a procedure or a therapy, in very narrow, what I call pristine patients. And that's why most of these studies don't work in real populations. But imagine the following. So you're a 79-year-old woman with 3 conditions. What you want to do is submit that, almost the whole medical record and the recent data, as a search term into a search engine that doesn't search Google, but searches the 200 million patient records and say, who are the 5,000 patients out of 200 million who were most like me, and what was the outcome for various therapies? What was the right trade-off between biasing it towards diabetes or osteoporosis? So you'll get a probabilistic assessment, probably with pros and cons for each, and then the patient will be empowered to choose.
On the question of perverse incentives, there's a lot of expense and cost and waste. There's opportunities for innovation in technology to reduce cost. For those of us who are actually trying to, who are trying to implement that, the money that is saved theoretically is not necessarily, viewed that way by the people who actually have to buy what people are selling. So I was wondering if all the panelists could comment on how we can make the financial case for innovation when that cost savings is in the future and is kind of abstract in a way.
Who's going to pay for the innovations to save money down the road? Well, to improve care, hopefully, and also save money down the road.
Well, you have to innovate. You just have to. 45 years ago, a patient with a heart attack was in the hospital for 6 weeks. The only medication available was a nitroglycerin. They were told to smoke less. They were smoking with oxygen in the room. That we didn't know how to prevent a pulmonary embolus. And think about what's developed over that period of time. If we didn't innovate, where would we be in terms of HIV therapy? Think about that. Now, we're certainly not at the end of that. So I think the notion that innovation is incompatible with cost reduction, even in the near term, is false. I think you have to both innovate and do very creative things around reducing the cost of care in the short run. But if we don't innovate, I think then we're really lost.
So I was just going to say that, for example, the innovation could come from the finance industry, who are looking to make profit from predictive analytics, but it's going to develop there and then move into healthcare. So that's one of the ways you can pay for it.
Well, I know I can see from the number of hands raised that there are many, many more questions. Unfortunately, the hour is late, and I do know that many people need to leave as well. There'll be an opportunity to come and chat briefly with the speakers also, if you'd like. But please join me in giving another round of applause to our panelists.
Let me just say, I've put my thoughts down on a paper on our website at khoslaventures.com. I'd love feedback and especially critique. That would be really valuable. Thanks.